400 Lakota warriors did not show up at Caleb Harrow's ranch to fix his fence for no reason. They came with purpose, maybe gratitude, maybe something heavier. Caleb was about to learn why. But to understand it, you have to go back to the day before, when everything started to unravel. If you're hearing this story, maybe on your phone or television, take a second to hit follow or share. It helps keep stories like this alive, and trust me, this one's worth it. The Montana sun was relentless that July afternoon, baking the cracked earth around Caleb's small ranch near the Yellowstone River. At 42, Caleb was a loner, not because he wanted to be, but because life had carved him that way. Years of wrangling cattle, fighting drought, and burying dreams. He was out by his northern fence line, sweat stinging his eyes, hammering a loose post back into the ground. That was when he saw them, three figures moving slow across the open plain, their shapes shimmering in the heat haze. They were not ranchers or lost travelers. Their deliberate steps, the way they leaned into each other, told him they were running from something. He squinted, shielding his eyes. A woman, a teenage boy, and a young girl, all in tattered Lakota clothing, were heading straight for his creek. Most folks around these parts would have grabbed a rifle, given the old wounds between settlers and the Lakota bands nearby. Caleb's fingers grazed the knife on his belt, but he stopped. Their stumbling gait, the way the girl clung to the woman's hand, screamed desperation, not danger. He dropped his hammer and walked toward them, keeping his hands open and visible. Up close, the woman's face was gaunt, her dark eyes sunken with exhaustion. The boy, maybe 15, stood tall despite his thin frame, his shoulders squared to shield the girl, who looked no older than 10. Their clothes were caked with dust, torn at the seams, and the woman's hands trembled as she pointed to the creek, her voice hoarse with Lakota words Caleb could not understand. The girl's legs shook, barely holding her up, and the boy's glare was more fear than defiance. Caleb gestured to his cabin, a weathered shack perched 100 yards away, its roof sagging under years of neglect. He motioned for them to follow, his voice low and steady, like he was calming a spooked horse. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting to the kids, then to the horizon, as if expecting trouble to crest the hill. She nodded, and they trailed him, the boy keeping himself between Caleb and the girl. Inside, Caleb dug through his sparse pantry some cornbread, a pot of beans from last night, a jug of water from the creek. He set it all on his wobbly table, the only flat surface in the cabin not covered in tools or dust. The family sat, the woman pulling the girl close, while the boy perched on the edge of his chair, eyes flicking to the door. They ate like they had not seen food in days, tearing into the cornbread with shaking hands. Caleb stood back, leaning against the wall, giving them space. The woman's gaze softened as she watched her kids eat, but it never left Caleb for long. He noticed a beaded bracelet on her wrist, its intricate patterns catching the dim light. It jogged a memory, something he had overheard at the Miles City trading post about a Lakota family, tied to a powerful elder, who had vanished after a clash with local cattlemen. If this was them, Caleb was not just feeding strangers, he was wading into deep water, the kind that could drown a man. As they ate, a sharp whistle cut through the air outside, low and piercing, like a signal meant to be heard but not seen. Caleb froze, his hand halfway to the water jug. The woman's head snapped up, her spoon clattering to the table. She grabbed the boy's arm, whispering fiercely in Lakota, her words tumbling fast. Caleb edged to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. In the fading light, he saw two figures crouching near his barn, their movements quick and practiced. They wore no war paint, but their braided hair and silent steps marked them as Lakota scouts. Caleb's pulse quickened. He turned to the woman, pointing outside, and she nodded, her face tight with something close to panic. She pulled the kids close, whispering again, and the boy's jaw tightened as he nodded back. Caleb caught one word: danger. These scouts were not here for him. They were tracking the family, and they were not alone in the growing dusk. He barred the door with a heavy plank and motioned for the family to stay low. The woman pointed to a small knife tucked into her belt, her eyes asking if Caleb was armed. He nodded, grabbing his old rifle from the corner, but kept it pointed down. He was not looking for a fight. Not yet. The whistling stopped, replaced by the faint crunch of boots circling the cabin. Caleb's mouth went dry. He whispered to the woman, asking if these were her people. She shook her head, her fingers tightening around the knife's handle. The boy crawled to the window, peeking out, then whispered to his mother, Her face hardened, and she spat out one word in English: outcasts. Caleb's stomach dropped. He had heard of Lakota outcasts, warriors cast out for breaking tribal laws, now roaming, answering to no one. If they found the family here, it was not just Caleb's life at stake. The kids would not stand a chance. Before he could think, hoofbeats thundered up the dirt path. Caleb's gut twisted tighter. He cracked the shutter again and saw 4 riders: his neighbor Tom Grayson, Sheriff's Deputy Will Carter, and 2 ranch hands he did not recognize. Tom dismounted, his face flushed with worry, and pounded on the door, shouting for Caleb to open up. Caleb unbarred it, stepping outside to meet them. Tom did not bother with hellos. He said smoke signals had been spotted in the hills, Lakota signals, and word was spreading about a missing family. Will, his badge glinting in the dying light, asked if Caleb had seen anyone. His eyes flicked past Caleb to the open door, where the woman stood frozen, the kids tucked behind her. Caleb admitted they were inside, fed and resting. Tom's jaw dropped, and Will's hand hovered near his holster, not drawing but ready. The ranch hands exchanged uneasy looks, their horses shifting nervously. Will said the family was tied to Black Elk, a Lakota elder who held sway over half the bands in the region. They had vanished after a run-in with cattlemen who swore the Lakota were rustling. The details were messy accusations: a burned camp, missing livestock, but Black Elk's people were out searching, and they were not in a mood to negotiate. Tom leaned in, his voice low, saying sheltering them could make it look like Caleb was hiding them, maybe even helping them dodge justice. Caleb said they were half-starved, not thieves. Will's eyes narrowed, and he said Caleb had until morning to bring them to town, or the Lakota would come first. As the riders turned to leave, Tom glanced back, his face pale, like he had seen something in the hills. Caleb followed his gaze and caught a flicker of movement: more scouts, or maybe those outcasts, watching from the shadows. The dust from the riders' horses hung in the air as the sun sank, leaving Caleb with a sinking feeling. Back inside, the woman was watching him, her eyes sharp now, like she was measuring his nerve. She spoke a few broken words in English: thank you, water, safe, but her hand stayed close to her knife. The boy said nothing, his fists clenched, while the girl curled up on a blanket Caleb had laid out, already half asleep. He tried to ask where they came from, but the woman just shook her head, pointing north, her face tight with worry. Caleb figured they had been running, maybe from those cattlemen, maybe from something worse. He knew turning them out now would be a death sentence. He barred the door again and sat by the window, rifle across his lap. The night was too quiet, the kind that made your skin prickle. Then, a sharp crack broke the silence, a branch snapping, too close to the cabin. The woman grabbed her knife, standing over the kids. Caleb eased the shutter open and saw a shadow dart behind his water trough. Someone was out there, and they were not waiting for dawn. The woman whispered to the boy, who nodded and slid under the table, pulling the girl with him. Caleb's hands tightened on the rifle, his palms slick. He did not want to shoot, but he was ready. A rough voice called from outside, not in Lakota but in broken English, demanding the family be sent out. Caleb's blood ran cold. It was the outcasts, and they sounded like they were past reasoning. The woman's face twisted with fear, but she stood firm, her knife catching the lantern's glow. Caleb cracked the door just enough to see. 3 men stood in the moonlight, their faces hard, armed with knives and a battered rifle. The leader, with a jagged scar across his forehead, pointed at the cabin and shouted again. Caleb said he would not hand over the family. The scarred man laughed, a cruel, barking sound, and said Caleb would bleed for playing savior. He raised his rifle, the barrel glinting, and Caleb braced for the shot. But before the trigger could be pulled, a low chant rose from the hills, deep and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Caleb's breath caught. The outcasts froze, their eyes darting to the darkness. The woman's face went pale, but her grip on the knife steadied. She whispered to Caleb, one word: Lakota. Black Elk's people were here, and they were not sneaking like the outcasts. Caleb stepped outside, hands raised, praying he could talk before anyone started shooting. The shadows in the distance took shape: dozens of warriors, some on horseback, others on foot, their faces painted with streaks of red and black. At their head was a man, tall and broad, his presence heavy as a storm cloud. Caleb knew this had to be Black Elk. The outcasts spun, their weapons raised, and the scarred leader spat at the elder, calling him a coward for parleying with settlers. Caleb realized this was not just about the family. The outcasts wanted blood, any blood, to prove their defiance. Black Elk raised a hand, and the outcasts' shouts died in their throats. His eyes locked on Caleb's cabin, then flicked to the scarred man, who sneered but stepped back. The elder dismounted, his boots heavy on the dry ground, and approached the cabin. The woman stepped out, the kids behind her, and called out in Lakota, her voice cracking with relief. Black Elk's face softened for a split second, then hardened again as he looked at Caleb. The boy spoke fast, pointing at Caleb, then the cabin, his words tumbling over each other. The woman joined in, her voice sharp and urgent, gesturing to the table, the blankets. Caleb caught enough to know they were defending him, saying he had fed them, kept them safe. Black Elk listened, his face a mask, but the scarred outcast shouted again, accusing Caleb of hiding the family for profit. The warriors stirred, their hands tightening on spears and bows, and Caleb felt the air grow thick with danger. Caleb's throat was dry as dust, but he spoke up, saying he found them starving, that he only wanted to help. Black Elk asked, in slow, deliberate English, why Caleb had not sent word to the Lakota. Caleb said there was no time, they needed food and rest, and with outcasts circling, he did not know who to trust. The elder studied him, his gaze lingering on the woman's beaded bracelet. He said she was his niece, the boy and girl, her children, the last of his brother's bloodline. The scarred outcast laughed, saying Caleb was a liar, probably working with the cattlemen who torched the family's camp. The boy stepped forward, his voice shaking but loud, saying Caleb had no part in that fight. The girl, clinging to her mother, pointed at the cornbread crumbs on the table, her small hand trembling but sure. Black Elk's eyes flickered, but the outcast raised his rifle, aiming at Caleb's chest, his finger twitching on the trigger. The woman's cry cut through the night like a blade. She stepped in front of Caleb, her knife raised, shouting at the outcast in Lakota. Her words were sharp, relentless, and even Caleb, who did not understand, felt their force. The scarred man's rifle wavered, his eyes narrowing. Black Elk spoke, his voice low but unyielding, ordering the outcasts to stand down or face the tribe's judgment. The warriors closed ranks, their faces carved from stone, and the outcasts backed off, slipping into the shadows like wolves. Black Elk turned to Caleb, saying his niece's trust was a start, but his people needed more than words. He said Caleb must come to their camp, face the council, and prove his heart was true. Caleb nodded, his pulse hammering, knowing refusal was not an option. As they prepared to ride out, a new sound broke the tension, a low wail, rising from the hills. The warriors froze, their faces tightening. Singing Bird, the woman, grabbed Caleb's arm, her eyes wide with fear. She whispered that it was a mourning song, sung for the dead. Black Elk's expression darkened, and he said one of his scouts had found a body in the valley, a young Lakota man, killed by the cattlemen who attacked the family's camp. The warriors' murmurs grew into a low growl, and Caleb felt their anger turn toward him, like he was a stand-in for every settler they blamed. Singing Bird spoke fast, her voice pleading, saying Caleb had saved her children when no one else would. The boy, Swift Deer, stepped forward, holding up a piece of cornbread, saying it came from Caleb's own plate. The girl, Little Star, clung to her mother, her eyes locked on Black Elk, silently begging. The elder raised a hand, silencing the crowd, and said the council would decide Caleb's fate, not the night's anger. They rode out before dawn, Caleb with them, his hands unbound but his rifle left behind. Singing Bird rode close, whispering that Black Elk was fair but bound by his people's pain. The camp was a few miles off, hidden in a valley where the river curved sharp. Hundreds of Lakota waited, their faces a mix of hope, grief, and suspicion. Black Elk called a council, the elders gathering in a tight circle under a cottonwood tree. Singing Bird spoke first, her voice steady now, telling how they fled after cattlemen burned their camp, how they wandered, starving, until Caleb found them. Swift Deer added that Caleb never threatened them, never asked for reward. Little Star, shy but clear, said Caleb gave her his only blanket, her small voice carrying in the still air. But as they spoke, a young Lakota woman stepped forward, her face streaked with ash, holding a bundle of charred cloth. She said it was from her brother's camp, burned in the same attack, and she demanded to know if Caleb had seen the cattlemen. Caleb's stomach knotted. He swore he knew nothing of the attack, that he lived alone and steered clear of trouble. The young woman's eyes blazed, and she threw the cloth at his feet, saying one of the cattlemen wore a hat like his, seen near the burned camp. The crowd erupted, shouts rising like a storm. Swift Deer jumped up, saying Caleb's hat was old, worn by half the men in Montana, not proof. Singing Bird grabbed the cloth, holding it high, showing it was not burned but stained with red dye, a mistake born of grief. Her voice broke as she begged the council to listen, saying Caleb's kindness saved her children. The young woman hesitated, her anger cracking, but the crowd was restless, some calling for vengeance. Black Elk silenced them, his voice like thunder, saying truth would come through actions, not accusations. The council's decision was harsh but clear. Caleb would work in the camp, not for a day, but until the elders saw his heart. At dawn, he started, hauling water from the river under the burning sun. Swift Deer stayed close, carrying buckets despite his thin arms trembling. Little Star followed, offering shy smiles that kept Caleb's spirits from breaking. By midday, his shoulders screamed, but he noticed something children from the camp were watching, not with hate but curiosity. A boy, no older than Little Star, ran up, offering a piece of dried meat, his mother nodding from a distance. Caleb took it, his throat tight with something he could not name. Singing Bird watched, her eyes bright with pride. The gesture was small, but it rippled through the camp, like a stone dropped in still water. Warriors who had glared now looked away, their hands less tight on their weapons. The work dragged into the afternoon, and Caleb's hands bled from digging post holes for a new corral. A group of young warriors, led by the scarred outcast who had stayed behind, taunted him, tossing pebbles at his feet, their laughs sharp as knives. Caleb kept his head down, focusing on the work. Swift Deer snapped at them in Lakota, his voice cracking with defiance, and they laughed harder but backed off. Then, a quiet warrior, his face marked with old scars, dropped his spear and picked up a shovel, working beside Caleb without a word. Others joined, their silence heavy with meaning. Singing Bird whispered later that the quiet warrior was the young woman's brother, and his choice to help was a signal. Caleb's chest tightened. He was not just proving himself to the elders, but to a people carrying years of loss. As the sun dipped, a new challenge arose. A group of warriors returned to camp, dragging a man bound in ropes, a cattleman, his face bruised, his hat like Caleb's. The young woman from the council screamed, rushing forward, saying this was the man who burned her brother's camp. The crowd surged, their anger a living thing. Caleb's heart stopped as the cattleman's eyes met his, pleading. Singing Bird grabbed Black Elk's arm, saying the man's capture did not damn Caleb. Swift Deer shouted that Caleb had fed them, not burned them. The elders raised their hands, and the crowd fell silent. Black Elk said the cattlemen would face their justice, but Caleb's fate was still his own to prove. The work continued, Caleb's hands shaking now, knowing one wrong move could tie him to the cattleman's guilt. By evening, Caleb's body was breaking, but he kept going, repairing a tent torn by wind. Little Star brought him water, her small hands steady as she handed him the cup. The quiet warrior stayed close, his shovel never stopping. Other warriors joined, their work a quiet answer to the taunts. Singing Bird translated their murmurs, saying some believed Caleb's heart was true, but others waited for him to falter. As night fell, a drum began to beat, slow and steady, calling the council back. The elders gathered, their faces unreadable. The oldest said Caleb's work showed his heart, and the family's trust was not misplaced. But Black Elk had more to say. He pointed to Caleb's ranch, miles away, and said his fence was broken, his cattle at risk. The Lakota knew loss too well. As a sign of peace, 400 warriors would ride to his ranch at dawn, not to fight, but to mend what was broken. Caleb's knees nearly gave out, not from exhaustion but from the weight of it. Before they left, the young woman from the council approached, her face softer now. She handed Caleb a beaded charm, small but heavy with meaning, saying it was her brother's, lost in the attack. She said he would have wanted Caleb to have it, for giving her family a chance. Caleb's fingers closed around it, his voice gone. Dawn broke, and he rode home, Singing Bird, Swift Deer, Little Star, and Black Elk beside him. 400 warriors followed, their horses raising a dust cloud that glowed in the morning light. They spread out along Caleb's fence line, hammers ringing, posts sinking deep into the earth. By midday, every wire was tight, every post solid. Swift Deer drove stakes, his face fierce with pride. Little Star handed out tools, her shy smile brighter. Even the scarred outcast, Red Hawk, swung a hammer, his eyes avoiding Caleb's but his work steady. Black Elk stood with Caleb, watching, and said kindness was rare, and it deserved an answer. Caleb's ranch was now under Lakota protection, a bond forged in one night's choice. As the warriors worked, a rider galloped in from town, Will Carter, the deputy, his face grim. He said the cattlemen were gathering, armed, claiming Caleb had betrayed them by siding with the Lakota. Caleb's heart sank, but Black Elk's face stayed calm. He called his warriors together, speaking in Lakota, his voice like iron. Singing Bird translated, saying Black Elk would send riders to meet the cattlemen, not for war, but to talk. Caleb offered to go, to explain, but Black Elk shook his head, saying this was their debt to repay. A dozen warriors rode out, their faces set, while the rest finished the fence. Hours later, they returned, dusty but whole. The cattlemen had backed down, faced with Black Elk's authority and the warriors' numbers. Will stayed, helping with the last posts, his badge tucked away. He gripped Caleb's hand, muttering that he had misjudged him, his eyes steady. The family stayed a day longer, resting before returning to their people. Singing Bird told Caleb they would not forget him, her voice warm but firm. Swift Deer shook his hand, his grip strong for a boy his age. Little Star hugged him, her smile no longer shy. Black Elk left last, saying Caleb's door would always be open in their camp. The warriors rode off, their silhouettes fading into the hills. That night, Caleb sat by his fire, the beaded charm in his hand, its colors dancing in the light. He felt a weight lift, one he had carried since his wife's death 5 years before. Months later, word spread. Ranchers who once spat at the Lakota's name came to Caleb's ranch, curious, some envious. Singing Bird visited yearly, bringing Swift Deer and Little Star, sometimes Black Elk. They shared meals, stories, and quiet moments by the creek. One visit, Swift Deer brought a horse, a sleek mare, a gift from the tribe. Caleb tried to refuse, but the boy said it was not just a gift, it was a promise. When Caleb died at 68, Swift Deer and Little Star stood among his neighbors and the Lakota, their presence a bridge built from one act of courage. His ranch remained a meeting place, where words replaced weapons, and trust grew from a single night's choice. If you're still listening, maybe on your couch or driving somewhere, take a moment to like or share this story. It's not just about Caleb, it's about what happens when we choose to help, no matter the cost. One click keeps stories like this going, and I think you'll agree, they're worth it.